speech.
Thank you, milady. Ms Donaghy, I'd like to spend some time this afternoon discussing the RQIA's inspection regimes and how they changed during the pandemic. You set out in your statement that prior to the pandemic, residential nursing homes were inspected at least twice every 12 months, and domiciliary care agencies were to be inspected once every 12 months. And your statement also sets out that up until the end of the financial year 2019-20, RQIA was consistently meeting those targets. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then, could I just ask you to briefly comment on something which is contained in the CQC's supplementary statement, where they acknowledge that the CQC recognises that on-site inspections are an integral part of regulation. Do you agree with that statement?
Absolutely.
And if I may then bring up a piece of correspondence from the Chief Medical Officer at INQ 000103688. This is dated the 20th of March, 2020. And it's entitled Coronavirus COVID-19 Departmental Direction. So this is one of those rare occasions where the department is directing RQIA to do something. And it states, the department is directing RQIA to reduce the frequency of its statutory activity, as set out in the Regulation Improvement, Regulations 2005, and cease its non-statutory inspection activity and review programme with immediate effect. Could you briefly just assist the inquiry in understanding that distinction? So there's statutory and there's non-statutory inspections. Which one relates to adult social care?
Statutory.
Statutory. And those are those inspections twice every 12 months and once every 12 months, which we've just outlined.
Yes.
This wasn't the RQIA's decision, this was the decision of the Chief Medical Officer, is that correct?
Yes, I'm conscious I'm just saying yes and no to you, and there's some things you've said earlier that I need to qualify with you, but yes, it was a directive, and as I explained earlier, directive compels the RQIA to comply. But if you wish, I would say the RQIA senior team at the time agreed with the decision. So that's something maybe we can come back to, or...
Well, I think that's perhaps sufficient. You weren't in post, you weren't even in the organisation at the time, but it's your understanding the RQIA senior team at the time agreed with the position adopted by the department?
Yes, because as I mentioned earlier, sir, that I have reviewed the documentation and spoke with senior staff. And may I very briefly just say, when you mentioned to me, maybe just for clarification, statutory meaning it's set out in the regulations. You must go on a particular frequency of inspection. It's a bit difficult at times because sometimes the words are used interchangeably. Statutory meaning NHS services. But in this context, statutory means where you are compelled to visit on a routine basis. And you mentioned earlier that I'd said in my statement, and I take it that I must have then, said that the inspections should be at least twice. May I clarify, it would ordinarily be twice, not at least, which implies we did a lot more than that. That wouldn't necessarily have been the case. It was a routine pattern of 2 inspections to a care home in an inspection year and 1 inspection to a domiciliary care agency.
Thank you. For present purposes, I'd really like to focus on this piece of correspondence here from the Chief Medical Officer. And you've accepted RQA were consulted. Do you know what, if any, consideration was given to inspections continuing in line with the regulations, but subject perhaps to the provision of testing or the provision of PPE? Were those matters considered in March 2020?
From my review reflection, no, those weren't matters that were part of the discussion. But the element of the letter that you've displayed on the screen, although it describes one element of it, I believe other part of the letter does indicate that inspections could be carried out on the basis of risk or judgment. I apologise that I don't just remember the exact words that were used, but it did imply that although these statutory, regular inspections would be stood down, Non-statutory applies to inspections carried out in the HSC in the hospitals. They're non-statutory, meaning there isn't a regular regime of it. But the letter does indicate, and you could undertake inspections on the basis of risk or judgment, I believe, sir, from my memory.
Do you know if, I'm going to return to this issue of testing and PPE,
Yes.
do you know if they were available to RQIA inspectors in March 2020?
No, they would not have been.
And was that
A factor.
Was that
No.
a capacity issue at that time in the system, or was that a choice?
Oh,
or
no. PPE became available in the latter part of March, to my recollection, and speaking with colleagues, and it was made available to us from the shared services organisation that we used to make supplies to us, and also donations and so on were delivered to us.
May I just take you to paragraph 128 of your witness statement? You outline that between April and June 2020, only 44 physical inspections took place. That's down from around 200 in the similar period the year before. And therefore, there'd been a significant reduction in activity. You then state at paragraph 152 of your statement, but upon reflection, RQIA believes that the direction, insofar as it affected care home and domiciliary care agencies, had a modest impact on RQIA's activity. Just considering the large reduction in inspections, and there was also a commensurate reduction in enforcement activity as a result. Do you continue, or can you explain why you consider it was only a modest impact?
If you'd be kind enough, I need to go back to the start of your sentence, because there's a quantum leap in there from the position of standing them down to a reflection on the impact of it. I would wish to say that the decision for standing down the regular inspections, from what I can ascertain from speaking with people and reading documentation, was a fear of footfall. Now, I have heard it said, and colleagues will often say to me, and how could one inspector going into one care home cause so much concern about a risk of transmission? But I do think it's important, sir, to say that in the scheduled inspection programme that we've mentioned briefly here, we have 17 care home inspectors for 470 care homes. That means each inspector has roughly a caseload of 30 care homes. So those who made that decision about standing down the scheduled inspections would have understood that one inspector would be going in and out of multiple care homes. That was the methodology at the time. And I believe it was a factor in concern about transmission. The letter that stood, the directive, did not give the reason for standing it down. I think it just said in these difficult times or something like that. But later, when it was rescinded, it referred to the transmission rate being lowered. Therefore, I conclude that my assertion that the original reason was footfall was further addressed. Now, I'll come immediately to the issue of this modest.
If you wouldn't mind, because
Yes.
you've stated here that it had a modest impact on RQA activity, and that's just the real issue I'd like to explore.
I agree with you.
Do you continue to maintain it only had a modest impact?
I do, because this is not about diminishing the impact of lost physical inspections of care homes or any other service for that matter. That was, as I said throughout my statement, significant. I mean, RQIA is known for its inspections, as are most service regulators. It's the most visible aspect of our work. So the loss of that is clearly immense. But what I was aiming to indicate by saying modest activity overall, we do have, as I mentioned earlier, a range of other rules. Registration and notifications about changes in managers, all of those types of things, and notifications about deaths, about accidents, about incidents. And as I mentioned earlier, we take calls every day from the public, from families, from care homes, from others, seeking advice and support about aspects. All of those other services continued and increased significantly. So, for example, calls to us in the month of April We received 2,200 calls that month from service providers and families and the public. Ordinarily, we would receive, on average, 300 calls in a month. So demand for other parts of the service increased close to tenfold. I was trying to indicate that staff in the RQIA were still busy working. Overall activity levels were increased dramatically, so much so that colleagues were working 7 days a week. So my word modest, maybe poorly phrased on my part, but was to indicate that overall work in the organisation expanded. But the loss of inspections, physical inspections, is a very significant matter.
You've already outlined there the contents of the 22nd of June letter from the CMO, which rescinded that direction. So from the 22nd of June, that direction's gone. Was RQIA expected then to revert back to twice annual and once annual for domiciliary care agencies from that point there on?
I'm not sure if there was an absolute clear expectation of that, but I do recall reading correspondence between the interim chief executive of the time and the Department of Health asking the chief executive, are you ready to recommence your inspection approach? And his response was, no, we're not. And he explained for a number of reasons, including the loss of inspectors through shielding and being unavailable and so on. I'm not sure if the department actually expected a return to twice annual. I believe it would be more likely to have understood that everybody realised as a result of the pandemic that intelligence-led inspection had to be a part of it. Once you've learned that, once you've understood that, you could not revert to a situation where you only inspect on the basis of some rota. It would not be practical or possible to do that. So I believe it was inherent in the arrangements. And I should say, sir, that the physical inspections recommenced on the 30th of April. So they did not wait for the letter rescinding the arrangements. The prompting to restart was based on the intelligence coming in, which I'm sure we may come to, and the fact that the original letter had indicated the idea of undertaking inspection on the basis of risk. But actually there was no methodology for that.
Well, perhaps
it hadn't been developed at that time.
Can I help us maybe explore the methodology and perhaps bring a bit of light on some of the issues you're raising here? So if I could have on screen, please, INQ 000475143, and specifically page 34, that's table 7. This is your statement, and setting out again the number of inspections which have been taking place. So 1920 there, we've got, looking at the bottom line, 1,408. That reduces to 860 for 2021. We never quite, or RQIA have never quite made it back up to the 1,408. Is that reflective of what you're describing, this shift away from we must inspect twice annually to more of a we need to go where the concerns lead us and to make sure that whatever intelligence we're receiving, we're focusing our attention there as opposed to on a strictly time-based approach?
A blend of both. In the past, pre-pandemic, the focus of RQIA inspections, or at least there was a very strong focus on achieving the target of 2 inspections or 1 inspection. And that's not to say that I'm quite certain those inspectors undertaking that work would have done so with diligence. However, since the pandemic and the work that was done during it, it has led us to understand that some care homes and others, but care homes in this instance, present factors that are going on in those homes present greater risk to patient safety than others. And therefore we have adopted a hybrid, a caution if you like, where we inspect all care homes once per year and we inspect as often as is necessary for others to ensure we've addressed the issues of risks that are presenting. So, for example, last year we would always visit all of the care homes once. 50% would have had 2 or more visits. And on preparing for the inquiry, the most inspections we carried out last year in a particular home was 5. Previous year there would have been 9. So it's not about counting, however. It's not about that. It's about ensuring we are using the information we have to drive regulatory efforts and ensure quality standards are met. We believe there's a hybrid therefore needed. There is a reassurance in going out on a regular pattern, whether or not there's intelligence that might draw to your attention. So we have introduced. We will not, in my view, get back to the 1,100 that we were doing previously. I don't think that will be practical.
Can I just ask you to keep your answers slightly shorter? I really appreciate you assisting. We've got a stenographer who's trying very hard to keep up, and it's probably both of our Northern Irish accents aren't doing anyone any favours.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to return to this period of time in which the direction, was in place, and I'm going to ask for evidence from the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Older People on the screen. So if I could have INQ 000474926, please, and page 50. Paragraph 149. It straddles the top of the page here. It's the position of the Commissioner that the advice seemed to me, he's talking about the direction, contradictory. The intent was clearly to reduce footfall in care homes, but given the infrequent activity in each home, the health qualifications of inspectors, and the fact that homes had social care staff coming in and out not tested, and not yet adequately trained in infection management control, the impact of a solitary inspector would have seemed a completely reasonable risk. Was any of that, to the best of your knowledge, considered in March 2020? And do you agree with the Commissioner that it would have been a completely reasonable risk?
Well, that's a big ask. But I go back to the point I made earlier. One inspector going in to 30 care homes. Each inspectors, if we had continued the approach, the scheduled inspections, had there been no change, then one inspector, assuming we could have retained all the inspectors and that people wouldn't have become unavailable, one inspector was not going into one care home. He or she would have been moving between homes. I believe that was understood by those made it, although it was not explicit in the documents that I read. So I can understand the Commissioner's perspective, but I think it jars a little with the reality of the caseloads. And
just on that then, on reflection, do you consider that the departmental direction, as it was set out, was appropriate?
But sir, I wouldn't be qualified to know whether that policy position has the scientific basis for reaching that conclusion. But RQIA's role has always been the implementation of policy and the compliance with it. So I wouldn't be qualified to say.
I'm going to return to the CQC's addendum statement then. And they adopt the position that in the event of a future pandemic, strenuous efforts should be made to protect the ability to carry out on-site inspections as much as is practically possible, but they play a vital role in ensuring the safety and quality of services. But it should be recognised that on-site inspections cannot take place in a pandemic if they increase risk to the care setting. Do you agree that in the event of a future pandemic, on-site inspections would have to play a vital role in ensuring safety and quality of services?
Yes, we do agree.
And having reflected, as you quite clearly have done, what could be done in the event of a future pandemic to ensure that the oversight provided by on-site inspections could continue as much as safely possible?
Well, I think it's an expansion of what I've already mentioned to you. Pre-pandemic, the only methodology known, understood, was rotational, a rota basis, an inspector aligned to 30 homes, for example. What is more important, we believe now, is that the skills and knowledge of the inspector should be aligned to the presenting risks in the care home. So, for example, very briefly, our inspectors would all come from a care background. So would the senior inspectors and indeed the directors, all, bar myself and chief executive role and other, I don't have a clinical background, but all of the colleagues working in the delivery of those services have a clinical care background. It's more important, and ordinarily for residential care homes in the past, our social work staff would have been assigned to carry out the inspections in residential care homes, most usually. In the new model, the adjusted model, we now align the experience of the inspector, whatever that background is, pharmacist, nurse, social worker, to the presenting issues in the home. And we still have the safety net, I suppose you would say, of having a regular, scheduled inspection programme as well. In a pandemic, our view is that the balance of these two should be adjusted. Rather than an abrupt end to inspection, we should leverage up the intelligence-based approach, reducing the scheduled, so that there's a portfolio of inspection approaches available, including remote and technically enabled where it is suitable. So there should not be a guillotine to the end of inspections, but rather a hybrid approach.
If I could ask you, that's very helpful in terms of bringing us on to virtual or the use of remote inspections. I understand from your statement that some 22 remote inspections were tried during the pandemic, or trialled, let me perhaps rephrase that, during the pandemic, covering both care homes and domiciliary care agencies. It's a relatively small sample size, but did that find that this would work in the future, or that there was scope for greater use of virtual, in particular in the context of care homes at this stage?
Yes, that was 22, if I recall correctly, in that period. So there were more than that, but not many. You're probably talking 50 or 60 in totality across the services. Care homes, in the main, found them cumbersome and difficult to facilitate because our inspection approach is threefold, if you like. You're listening, you're speaking, you're hearing what people are telling you, you're looking at documents and so on, and then you're observing. This is pretty difficult to do using remote technology. The care manager, care home manager, would have had to email documents to us, for example, so that we could look at rotas and policies and procedures, maybe visitors' logbooks, that sort of thing. It facilitated the verbal okay in terms of all of that, and then they're using an iPad or something to show you around the building and so on. Care homes generally indicated as they found it cumbersome, difficult and time-consuming, but not so much so in supported living, domiciliary care. It seemed to be more suitable for that environment, and I've noticed some of the other respondents have indicated that as well. So I think we certainly will keep it in our portfolio of methods, but it seems to be more suitable to a domiciliary care setting than a care home setting.
In the future, do you consider that it would be helpful or necessary to have clear protocols, written protocols, escalation in terms of this is how RQA would go about its business in terms of inspecting, these are the factors to consider? Would it be helpful to have a clear protocol setting out those steps, how in-person, remote and a blend of the two would be used? Would that have been helpful, and would it be helpful?
Well, it was essential. And that is, from the stepping down of the inspections on the 20th of March, or the stopping, just to be absolutely clear, the stopping of the physical inspections, they recommenced with the first of them were these virtual inspections on the 24th of April, and then the first physical inspections on the 30th of April. To lead up to that, the documentation you've described was developed. So a risk matrix was developed about determining the intelligence that would be used to decide whether it was a physical or virtual. All of those things had to be developed. Inspector packs, so to speak, had to be developed, so they were preparing for the inspection in a different way, because remembering now, you don't have an inspector necessarily aligned to a home that he or she is familiar with. So all of that had to be devised, including adjustment of the templates used for the reports produced after the inspection. Those were all revised, updated, if you like, to allow for that hybrid approach. So they would be absolutely essential and are now part of our policies and templates that we would use in those circumstances.
If I could move away from inspections to ask you some questions about the services support team, which RQIA put in place. Briefly, was this an initiative which RQIA proposed, or was it directed by the department?
I'm not certain if I could be precise about it, but it certainly seemed to reach an agreed position on it. Whether who suggested it first, I couldn't honestly say, although I have read all the documentation, but it seemed to be reached an agreed position on it. It's interesting, I suppose, to say that when I look back over the correspondence and so on, I did note that the chief executive at the time, the substantive chief executive, way before there was any correspondence issued about RQI setting up this team or being a point of contact for care homes and what have you, the chief executive said in an email to the Department of Health, when they were discussing, it seemed, the standing down of inspections, she replied, yes, I would agree with you, some words to that effect. And she went on to remark, because we are inundated with requests for support. This is, I think, the 13th of March. So, who suggested it first that we should develop a support services team? I'm not certain. But there was a demand for it, so to speak. Up until that, we would have had, like most regulators, I imagine, a duty inspector, a duty desk. So we would have had one inspector usually taking calls on a day-to-day basis, maybe with an extra person to support when it was needed. But given the scale of this demand, literally thousands of calls coming in, from late March, there were 500 or 600 calls. The following month, 2,500 almost. There was a need to develop that. I should make it plain, this support services team is the inspectors.
Yes.
This is the same group of people supported by senior inspectors and other senior officers and administrative staff.
If I may just take this opportunity to assist perhaps in helping understand exactly what we're talking about. So on the 25th of March, so roughly 2 weeks after that correspondence from the former chief executive, the chief social worker wrote to everyone, all registered providers, and said the main objective of this exercise is to ensure that providers have a single point of contact to raise issues and receive the most up-to-date advice, guidance and support from RQIA's expert teams of inspectors who are all registered nurses, social workers or allied health professionals. Did this services support team provide or perform any type of regulatory function, or was it more in the realms you were talking about earlier of the supporting side of RQI's work?
Well, it's the supporting side. However, I would suggest that our work as a regulator is to support providers in many ways to achieve compliance. I mean, yes, I've heard us, reported as, we're a policing service and so on. But actually part of it is, we would commend a care manager for ringing us. A care home manager ringing us to ask for clarification on a guidance that's been issued, or to discuss concerns they have about not having sufficient number of staff, or worried about accepting a discharge of a patient from hospital. We would commend providers for doing that. We think that is part of regulation, where they say, how will I go about this? What are others doing? What answers might I have? Those staff that are working in the support team at that time are inspectors who knew these care managers. A lot of them would have been known to each other. They've built up a working relationship over a long period of time. It's problem solving together. So they're talking together about, well, what options do you have? How have you addressed that before when you had staff shortage, or, trying to prompt and support the care home manager. I would not see that as, some describe regulation as being the policing of it. But I do think that supporting people to understand what's required of them, and they accepting advice and seeking advice, is not a conflict with regulation. But in the definition you've given there, it seems these things are opposites or are not complementary. But I would suggest they're complementary.
I'm just going to give you an opportunity to comment on something which was contained in the Nicol report, which we discussed before the break. If we could have INQ 260638 on page 12, please. The reviewer here acknowledges that the services support team appear to have, the providers, the trust and the department appear to have appreciated the RQI's efforts as part of the HSC response to the pandemic. But then at paragraph 24, this decision to make RQIA into a single point of contact and support for providers fundamentally altered the purpose of the RQIA. Now, I'm not particularly interested in the second part of that sentence because that almost goes back to governance matters we discussed earlier. But do you accept that the services support team amounted to a fundamentally altered purpose of RQIA? And perhaps just to borrow the language of the NI COVID bereaved in their written opening submissions, they say a listening ear is very different from a critical eye. Do you accept that this amounted to, in fact, a shift in position on the part of RQIA from its statutory function?
Yes, because the Nicol report was accepted fulsomely by the authority. So I'm not disputing any of the points that the Nicol report, identified. And I do think it was certainly an unusual step. But there was a phrase you used there about sort of a listening ear. I would just add, and I know I already have said it, Sarah, but the support team were more than listening. They were advising, encouraging, empowering, problem solving. And I think that's complementary to our role as a regulator.
If I may just allow you to comment on a final piece of written evidence the inquiry has received, which is a witness statement on behalf of Disability NI from a Joanne Sansom, which appears at INQ 000520343, and in particular paragraph 113. Thank you. The RQIA's decision to set up the services support team at the start of the pandemic brought about many benefits to the care sector service providers, as it acted as a good source of information and advice which was not always available through published guidance. That service, however, should not have been at the expense of inspections. The SST also sadly stopped operating without warning as the pandemic eased, and Disability Action are not aware that it was reinstated for the second wave. Now, I fully appreciate you've said that it was manned in effect by the inspectors, but I suppose when and why was it stopped? And is it possible to have inspections and the support team, or is it a simple choice of one or the other?
No, it is possible to have both. And I agree with the point that it shouldn't be at the expense of inspections. I agree entirely with that. And as I've said on reflection, our view now is that inspections, physical and remote, should they be needed, should be protected. And there should be a balancing of the method that is used. The support services team emerged and evolved into what we now call the guidance team. So the support services team, as was described, which was a very significant number of inspectors and admin staff, reduced, but it remained in place. We continued to have inspectors made available, but a very small number, and we had complemented it with administrative staff. We still have it to this day. We have 2 dedicated staff taking all of the calls on a day-to-day basis, and we have inspectors on duty desk supporting and providing them. So we didn't stand it down. It was not stood down abruptly. But I do agree as well, we did not make sufficient efforts possibly to communicate that with the public. So it would have been unknown, and I can understand the individual's perception that it had been stood down. The demand changed dramatically. From that month of April, when I've mentioned the 2,000 odd calls, the following month in May, you're talking somewhere around 600, then 500, then over the summer and into those other months, roughly typical numbers, not a great way to explain it, but about 300 calls. So we sized the team proportionate to the demands that were coming in.
Okay. If I just may bring on to a couple of other aspects of the RQIA's management or handling or assistance during the pandemic. A general point perhaps at first, at paragraph 231, you state that from April 2020, RQIA, on behalf of the Department and Public Health Agency, acted as a distribution point for the latest departmental direction and guidance. There's some suggestion that perhaps regulators could take on a broader point or broader role than just distributing guidance, but actually using their knowledge of the sector to produce guidance. Do you accept that that may have been of assistance? And then, if it's not unfair to ask you, would it have been an assistance, and would it be compatible with RQIA's role as the independent regulator?
We do, my colleagues do, produce guidance for care sectors, including care homes, but it is guidance on the interpretation of the policy. The guidance you're referring to, I believe, sir, is policy itself. It's guidance around visiting, infection prevention control and so on. My RQIA colleagues would write guidance for providers to describe to them the evidence that RQIA would be seeking to demonstrate compliance with those policies. We would not write the policy document or the guidance document in itself.
Thank you. Can I ask you briefly about visiting? And in particular, I'd like to focus some attention on the care partner concept, which was produced, I believe, in September 2020. And there's attempts to roll it out thereafter. In your statement, if we could have INQ 475143, in particular page 7 up, please. And paragraph 23 there, you describe being involved in a group along with representatives of the former Health and Social Care Board, the Public Health Agency and the Patient Client Council. I think this is what's known as the Care Home Engagement Platform.
Yes.
In the very last sentence, the PCC, the Patient Client Council, would also make referrals to RQIA where families had concerns about the implementation of this guidance and would follow up on these. And in a similar vein then, paragraph 209 of your statement, you set out that RQIA's care home inspectors considered both the visiting and the care partner guidance during inspections, ensuring these were appropriately implemented. Whenever the PCC or any other body raised concerns with RQIA about visiting and in particular the care partner concept, what action would RQIA then take?
Concerns raised by Patient Client Council or families rang us themselves or through the trusts. Each of those would be followed up by an appropriate inspector to the particular care home in question. And efforts made to ensure that the provider, the care home provider, took steps to comply with the visiting guidance. I'll maybe speak separately about the care partner, which was a little different. If it's helpful to say, sir, it may be useful to say that in Northern Ireland, the right to have access to visitors while you're living in a care home is already set out in the regulations and standards. So that's already a part of it, and I've read from others that I know that's being developed in other jurisdictions, but it's already a part. But there's no denying, it was one of the most difficult policy decisions to try to ensure compliance with. I noticed on the screen, as you put up a moment ago, reference to the guidance that was issued out, and I counted up in my own statement 22 incidents of where RQIA issued guidance and clarification to care homes about visiting. Some of those within days of each other. So we were issuing on behalf of the department complex, challenging guidance for implementation out to care homes quite rapidly and repeatedly. The job of the inspectors and senior inspectors and others was to secure compliance with that, even despite the changing nature of it, even despite the evolving nature of it. And so they intervened in individual cases. And I've reflected on some of those records and notes and so on to assure myself that individual actions were taken, and I'm satisfied that there were. Sometimes it took incredible amounts of time to try to find a solution with the provider that they were satisfied with. I mean, you will know, I'm certain, that for registered homes, when you walk into a care home in Northern Ireland, possibly other parts of the UK are the same, there's a certificate on the wall, and it's issued by the regulator. And the names on the certificate are the registered manager and the responsible individual. And what we found was that there was a huge level of fear of footfall, including family visits, sadly. And the inspectors and other colleagues found it at times, sometimes providers were able to manage and convert the guidance into operational practices and get things in place, but there were times where it was incredibly difficult, and there was a lot of work required.
You've mentioned there, and please forgive me for speaking over you, of course, you've mentioned there that at times the inspectors found issues,
yes,
and that a lot of work was required. And you also referred to the word intervened if appropriate. Can you confirm if any regulatory enforcement action was taken against a care home or in Northern Ireland regarding visiting restrictions or the care partner concept?
I'm just going to take both of those, sir. No is the answer in both, to be brief about it. And I think for the visiting, I'll come to the care partner, but for the visiting, whilst it was established in the standards and regulations from the outset, visiting in care homes in Northern Ireland up until that point was open visiting. I mean, bar circumstances where you maybe a flu outbreak or gastroenteritis or something like that, and families and others would have understood there may be an interference with visiting. But it was a new idea, a new concept that of restricting it. And as I say, rapidly changing and evolving the arrangements for it. The judgment call by the multidisciplinary team of inspectors and seniors was that the approach should be supportive, encourage compliance. They did not use enforcement at that time, although I do know from speaking to some that at times it came close to that. But they felt they made progress, being more proportionate and focused and so on. Care partners, in the correspondence from the Department of Health that I have read, says it does not have legislative underpinning. So it wasn't tested, so to speak. We did not take a regulatory action, but care partners are not visitors. Care partners are not employees or volunteers. So I'm not certain the legislation we have would have enabled us to take enforcement, and we didn't try.
Can I ask you, on reflection, and given the importance which is no doubt attached to visiting in care homes, as you say, which is underpinned by the regulations in Northern Ireland, could the RQAA have done more to ensure that visiting was available?
It's difficult to say retrospectively, but if the same circumstances arose now, would we be more likely to take enforcement action? I suspect so, but only because the guidance is now something people sadly have become more familiar with. It's already in the standards. There is potential to take enforcement action. I suspect it might be considered more. But we do have to remember, I mean, care homes are not one facility that's multiplied, across our region. I mean, care homes, every one of them are bespoke. Many of them are bespoke built, of course they are, but others are not. Others have come, from a range of paths. And the idea that it's readily achievable to implement a single policy at scale, at pace, without some kind of consideration of the circumstances for that particular home, its layout, its residents, its staffing. It takes judgment to consider what's the most appropriate, proportionate mechanism to achieve that end outcome that you're after.
If I may move on to the issue of isolation facilities, and if I could refer you to INQ 514710, in particular paragraph 29. And this is guidance from the Department of Health dated the 26th of April 2020. And I say paragraph 29. Some care homes will have been assessed by the RQIA as not having the ability to appropriately isolate individuals because of the configuration of their premises. What I would like to explore with you is, when was that assessment carried out? How rigorous was that assessment?
It was carried, assessment, I suppose, is the correct word for it. During the month of March 20, RQIA staff made calls out to care homes and other providers. They made 1,200 calls as what was called part of a preparedness assessment. And for care homes, there were around over 400 participated in that, and over 200 of the domiciliary care providers. And when colleagues were asking care homes, they asked them a self-assessment. It was self-assessed, if you like, in that the RQIA staff would have said, if you need to isolate an individual or a number of individuals because of maybe someone discharged from hospital or an outbreak in the home, do you have the capacity, do you have the mechanism to do that? All those calls were recorded, and those homes that indicated they believed they would have a problem were recorded and risk rated, if you like. So they were red risk rated, for want of a better description. Those were then followed up with individual calls from experienced senior inspectors. There were not many. From my knowledge of speaking to colleagues, you're talking less than 10 out of the over 400 who indicated that. The colleagues went back and said, sort of prompted with the individual, well, hold on, let's think about that again, because all homes have had to, at times, create isolation facilities for flu and so on. And so there were no homes that to the best of my knowledge, that were identified as could not isolate. There were solutions sought and explored with all of those homes, although several then ended up also having inspectors go out on a sort of not an inspection as such, but a support visit to assist the home, particularly residential homes, who tend to be smaller than the nursing homes. They tend to be, several of them, quite small. So some inspectors went out on support visits, basically to talk through these things. We never got to a point that there were homes on a list who couldn't provide isolation.
Thank you. We've obviously talked an awful lot this afternoon about residential and nursing homes. Do you accept, or do you have any comments on the level of assurance or regulation provided to domiciliary care agencies during the relevant period? Were the arrangements in place sufficient to ensure oversight of those services?
This is a difficult one, sir, because, as I said earlier, milady, there's 300 agencies, which already sounds quite remarkable when you think of it. 300 domiciliary care agencies registered with us. 100 of those, roughly, are traditional agencies, and the inspections of those began in earnest, I would say, again from July onwards. But the area that would concern RQIA are the domiciliary care services provided in supported living settings, because, as I mentioned earlier, the supported living facilities themselves are not registered. It's the personal care entering into them. There's more work to be done there.
Thank you. Particularly focusing on the home care, the domiciliary care, out with the supported living scenario, what more could be done to strengthen that oversight and assurance in the event of a future pandemic?
Well, for all of our services, and particularly domiciliary care, we definitely need to strengthen our arrangements for listening to service users and their families. More insight from service users, more efforts made by us. We're very mindful during the pandemic we did not have a presence in terms of communication with the public and families and so on. We very much focused on the service providers. It's clear to us now that where people are living independently, clearly the service users themselves and their families, loved ones and neighbours and friends can offer an immense amount of insight, and that's an area we have to focus on.
And is that for the RKIA, or is there scope for greater collaboration with other bodies like the PGC?
There's certainly greater scope for collaboration. I would say very briefly, there's an opportunity for RQIA to, what I would say, harvest intelligence from other sources who can add to enabling us to make informed, decisions around our work.
And then I suppose just a final question, and we've covered your discussion about the balance and blended inspections and how that looks, but is there any other steps that you think would need to be taken in the event of a future pandemic to ensure that the RQIA continues to provide a high level of independent assurance to both the department and to the public?
I would say we say this word intelligence, data, information, whatever you want to refer to it as. To have an intelligence-based approach, you have to have intelligence. And the legislation in Northern Ireland is such that, well, I would suggest that it's outdated and needs to be modernised. We get a lot of information from care homes. They're required to send us enormous amounts of information around events that occur, accidents, incidents, deaths, medicines, all of those things, which is invaluable. But when you come to domiciliary care, strictly speaking, the only thing that's required to be notified to RQI is if the police are involved. Now, clearly that would not be sufficient information to allow you to make intelligence-based decisions, and hence the need for us to evolve our computer systems. They're outdated, work with AI and all these other sorts of things that we can harvest. There's, a whole range of information from the Patient Client Council, from the Ombudsman, from the Care Opinion platform. All of these things could be potentially harvested to help inform regulatory work.
Thank you very much, Ms Donnelly. Thank you, Milady. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr Beach. Ms Campbell. Ms Campbell's just there.
Ms Donaghy, I ask questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Families for Justice, and I'm very grateful to Mr Beach, who has been comprehensive and in fact has touched on some of the issues. But one topic that we wish to ask you questions about is the issue of DNA CPRs and the availability of medical treatment. And the reason we ask you about it is because Eddie Lynch, who you know is the Commissioner for Older People, notes that early in the pandemic he was receiving concerns about blanket decisions being made about the treatment and care options available to older and vulnerable people. And of particular concern, he was receiving reports about older people feeling pressurised into signing DNA CPRs. And to be clear, that was coming also from some care home managers. And such was the concern that on the 30th of March 2020, so just to put that into the pandemic terms, we're very early, if you like, at the start of the pandemic, just 10 days after you had ceased inspections and so on. So the 30th of March, a joint statement was issued by Copney and by his counterparts in Wales and in Scotland, and with Age NI and Age UK and others, rejecting suggestions that treatment decisions could be blanket ones based on age alone, or with a person's age being given undue weight together with other factors, and calling out such blanket approaches as completely unacceptable. And so my question is this: so far as you know, was the RQIA aware of that joint statement from Copney and others at the time, at the end of March 2020?
I would have to say it has not in my knowledge. I wasn't aware of that statement, nor in my, I would say, extensive preparations for today was it brought to my attention. I did make some remarks in my statement about DNA CPR, and on reading and listening to the testaments of others in preparation for the inquiry, I did make further investigations into it on behalf of RQIA. I said in my statement, it was not an issue raised with us very much. Now, I find that difficult to understand given the scale of concern that I've now been made aware of. But those colleagues who were active at the time did not recall it being raised generally with them. And as a result of that, I requested our information department to electronically search all narrative records raised with us from March 2020 to the end of the following March. That was 8,500 records. And to search all of them for DNA, CPR, resuscitation, DNR, any words that might draw out the matter. I found 13 incidents, and they were across all services, including acute hospitals. The two issues that were raised with us in care home actually had drawn out the word resuscitate, and it was queries from care homes about the use of particular masks for resuscitation of people who were COVID positive. I am not certain why that issue is not featuring more with RQIA. I believe it should. RQIA would be well positioned, as I saw CQC did and undertook a review of that. RQA would have the authority to undertake that without needing direction. So now that I am aware that this is an issue, and I'm sorry it is late in the day, it is something I can certainly raise with the authority.
Well, you've to some extent answered my next series of questions, but if I might just unpack that a little bit more. Firstly, you accept that these issues would ordinarily fall within the RQIA's remit where concerns are being raised more broadly.
No, may I qualify
yes,
that?
Of course.
I'm surprised that it didn't fall to us given we were, or raised with us given we were identified as a single point of contact, at least for a period. But no, it wouldn't be usual that medical issues would be raised with us. That wouldn't be usual. We don't have medical personnel as part of our inspection programme. We have a small number of doctors, but psychiatrists and that sort of area where our mental health work. So my thinking was that perhaps it was more likely to have been raised with general practice or with the trusts. So that's where I'm thinking it was part of advanced care planning. To far as I'm aware of. So I'm surprised it wasn't more raised with us. But we could undertake work in that regard. Any aspect of policy that's important to people, communities, the department, other stakeholders, RQI do have the authority to examine without the need for direction. So it's certainly something, as I say, I'm now aware of.
Have you found whether the issues raised, and I know you weren't aware of the joint statement by Cockney and others at the time, but on your review of the records, have you found any indication that the RQIA was aware of that joint statement?
No, I haven't been. I'm surprised at that. And I had done quite a bit of research around it.
You have touched on the CQC report. You're clearly familiar with it, and the inquiry has heard some more evidence in relation to it this morning. And the CQC found, and this is from the forward to the report, to the final report, a worrying picture of poor involvement, poor record keeping, a lack of oversight and scrutiny of decisions being made. And without those in place, they couldn't be assured that decisions were and are being made on an individual basis. And no doubt you heard the evidence that was given this morning. Do RQIA records indicate that there was any review of the CQC report and its recommendations for relevance to Northern Ireland?
Not to my knowledge.
And does that surprise you?
Well, it disappoints me. It disappoints me because we're interested, we're passionate actually about the care of people across all of the sectors we regulate and register and regulate. So it's disappointing for me. Ordinarily, RQA undertake study, review, make recommendations on a body of evidence that we have accumulated ourselves, ordinarily. But I believe in this case, having, this is a national review inquiry, and if the CQC findings are replicated in Northern Ireland, it may be that there is a need to check and test that they are still the same, but RQI would be well placed to follow up on that. I'm disappointed that I wasn't aware of it earlier, but that's likely down to my own not researching sufficiently.
Well, in fact, in his evidence to Module 3, the former Minister for Health, Mr. Swan, indicated that it was his understanding that the CQC had looked at what was happening in Northern Ireland in the course of their review, and therefore sort of encompassed, if you like, a review of Northern Ireland. Is that the understanding of the RQIA?
Well, as I say, I am not able to comment on that because though I had read the CQC report, I must admit I hadn't identified that they had engaged Northern Ireland, and that I saw the sample that they had taken. It didn't resonate with me that Northern Ireland was part of it, although I did note that at least one and possibly more of the recommendations were made at a national level. So I think I would need to check and test that is appropriately applicable to Northern Ireland, and if so, there would be no reason, in my view, that the authority wouldn't look to check that it is being implemented in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. I'll move on, please, if I may, to deal briefly with what had been termed the withdrawal and reduction of inspections, but actually what you told us this morning, or this afternoon, your evidence is effectively the stopping of inspections after the 20th of March 2020. We know, of course, that didn't happen in isolation. We know that in parallel, GP visits were largely withdrawn or reduced. Social workers were denied access, and of course, families who wished to visit and care for their loved ones were shut out. You indicated this morning, firstly, that the CMO, when he directed the suspension or reduction of inspections, indicated that such inspections as would be carried out should be on an evidence-led, an intelligence-led or risk-assessed basis. But in fact, you've told us that there was no methodology in place for an assessment of risk-led or intelligence-led inspections. So the question is, where was the evidence or intelligence to come from, and how was it to be assessed in circumstances where individuals who might otherwise raise safeguarding concerns were locked out?
The development of the app that we referred to earlier, or I think we referred to earlier in the statement at least, and later the portal, once that abrupt end, and I want to be clear about it, that there were inspections held during the month of April, small number, but they were to homes that were not occupied. They were estate services matters, and they were not occupied, so I'm dismissing those for want of a better word. But as you say, the idea to move to an intelligence-led approach meant there needed to be intelligence. So very rapidly, the RQI information team developed an app that was issued out to all homes. All of the homes in Northern Ireland would be on a sort of an email call with us. We would be regularly in touch with care homes, and we'd all have points of contact for them. So an app was developed by colleagues, issued out to care homes within a matter of days. And it must have been a tremendous burden, do not get me wrong, for care homes to complete that on an online basis, because it was disconnected from the portal, which would have had all of their, long-standing data in it. So we had to quickly establish a source of intelligence, and by there was quite a substantial amount of data required on that. It was invaluable. It was along with the phone calls coming in from the managers in the homes. As I said earlier, the support services team were listening and helping. But in that call, you're also getting a tremendous amount of insight into what's going on.
I don't wish to cut across you, Ms Donaghy, but of course you have lines of communication open between the RQIA and care homes. The question is more, when you don't have others who perhaps have a more independent eye, GPs, social workers, and of course, very importantly, family members who are either present or who have access to your app, do you accept that there was a huge amount of evidence missing from any assessment?
Yes, I do.
And there was no ability at that point in time for the RQIA to collect or weigh it into?
I agree, very little. Families did still contact us, but in relatively small numbers. And I suspect that was because we didn't make ourselves as visible as we should have.
Right. And so against that background, can you understand why the decision to stop inspections had a very significant impact on public confidence in the RQIA?
I absolutely can.
You mentioned a small number of inspections. In fact, we understand there were just 3 inspections in April.
That's correct, and they were all on the 30th of the month.
Indeed, very end of the month, and to buildings with no occupants.
Those the earlier ones were earlier in the month, but they were to buildings with no occupants.
So how really could the RQIA begin to assess the ability of homes to keep their residents and patients safe in circumstances where there were no eyes and ears on the ground?
We very much relied on the reporting from care homes themselves, from managers, from trusts, from families making contact with us during that 5 to 6 week period. I should also say that inspections are critical, physical inspections. I hope I've made that claim. But we're not out inspecting every day or even regularly. Even in the current circumstances, we're out once every year in all homes and multiple times in others. So there always has to be alternatives over and above inspection. Inspection in many ways is the pinnacle, if you like, where you get the opportunity to observe at first hand. But we do have to rely on other methodologies. Returns from care homes, these notifications, phone calls from whistleblowers, phone calls from PCC or from Copney. Since the pandemic, we've developed, I think, not long overdue, much better relationships with the Commissioner of Older People and the PCC and so on. Those were things too that were not well advanced at the time of the pandemic.
Finally, this, and it's touching briefly on the issue of domiciliary care, and you've assisted with evidence on that already. You note in your witness statement, and again you touched on it just briefly, that there was no statutory requirement for domiciliary care agencies to report COVID-19 outbreaks, and no legislative amendments were made to impose such a duty. And so we end up in a situation where domiciliary care agencies had the option to self-report via a voluntary app. Was that an adequate and effective means of monitoring outbreaks during the pandemic in domiciliary care?
It certainly was an improved means, because prior to that we would have had no source, bar the once-a-year inspection, calls, and anything the provider might wish to draw to our attention. So was it adequate? It was an improved position, but it was voluntary. There was no underpinning of legislation in it. And you'll have noticed, I'm sure, in the statement that since then, domiciliary care agencies, or at least some, have opted to voluntarily continue to send us information on other broader matters over and above the police being involved. But that's has its difficulties because, again, I'm not certain it's consistent. I'm not sure everybody does it. So therefore, relying on that as a basis of intelligence wouldn't be sufficient. There's much more to be done in terms of strengthening that.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. That completes the questions we have for you. Thank you very much indeed for your help and obviously for all the work you've done trying to prepare to answer our questions. And we're grateful to you. And I don't know if any colleagues assisted you in preparing your statement, but if they did, thank you to them.
Thank you very much, Lady Helen. Thank you.
Very well, I shall return at 2:25. 3. Mr Beach.
Yes, thank you, my lady. May we please call Miss Gillian Bransky?
And if you take that in the right hand, please, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Bransky, I'm sorry you've had to wait till the end of the day. You're our last witness of the day. I hope it's not been too long a wait for you.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you, Miss Bransky. And thank you for your witness statement, which is dated the 20th of January 2025. I'm going to ask you a number of questions arising out of that. You're currently the Chief Inspector of Care Inspectorate Wales, is that correct?
I am, yes.
And is that a role you held during the pandemic?
I did.
I'm just going to start by asking you some questions about the Care Inspectorate Wales and its function. And in your statement, in the 2019 Code of Practice, it set out the Care Inspectorate Wales has in place robust registration processes, undertakes both routine and responsive inspections, and has clear, progressive and proportionate enforcement pathways. Is that, albeit a short summary, a broad overview of the regulatory function of the Care Inspectorate?
Yes, it is, in connection with adult social care.
Thank you very much. And what purpose or why does it matter that the Care Inspectorate regulates adult social care?
I think it's important that we can provide assurance to, firstly, the public, and then, of course, to ministers on whose behalf we exercise our function, about the quality and safety of the care that's provided in the adult social care sector.
And for the purposes of this module, it's correct that care home services with and without nursing provision and domiciliary support services both fall within that regulatory remit.
Yes, they do.
Inspectorate. And you do set out in your witness statement that the 31st of March 2020, there were 263 adult care homes with nursing, 790 without, and some 526 domiciliary support services.
Yes, there were.
If we took March, perhaps the 1st of March 2020 as like a snapshot, what, if any, concerns did the Care Inspectorate have about the nature or the makeup of the sector or the workforce?
I think it's fair to say that the pandemic didn't create fragility in social care, but that had existed for some time. And the sector in Wales for adult social care, our care homes tend to be quite small, often family run, but with a very passionate and dedicated social care workforce. It's clear that there were issues about demand across the social care sector. There were issues for recruitment and retention. And so, despite the best efforts of the social care workforce, there were existing underlying concerns about how social care operated.
And I know that, at least in the part of the Care Inspectorate, those efforts, the best efforts you say of that sector and those employees is greatly appreciated, and you perhaps wish to acknowledge that briefly.
I think it's probably important, if I can, to say that the period of the pandemic was an incredibly difficult time and absolutely devastating for anyone who lost a family member or friend. But it was also quite a privilege to witness the dedication of the social care workforce. We were humbled at times by their resilience and innovation and determination. Where we saw in the Care Inspectorate poor care, we took action. But there were many, many examples of really selfless, dedicated, compassionate care supported by strong management. And our relationship with providers is one of trying to work with as well as take action where there are problems.
Thank you. I wish to spend some time this afternoon discussing the Care Inspectorate Wales' inspection regimes and routines. And you do set out in your statement in quite a bit of detail about the relevant methodology and the nature of those inspections. But perhaps if we could have up on the screen INQ 569773, and it's table 3, which appears at page 20, just at the very top of the page there. You set out here in effect the inspection requirements in terms of time, and it varies according to whether it's a care home with adults, whether it's got nursing support, or it's a domiciliary support service. And I also appreciate that the code of practice sets out it was always informed on the basis of risk and intelligence coming in.
Yes.
Prior to the relevant period, was the Care Inspectorate Wales successful in inspecting these services in line with these requirements?
We would do what we could within those timeframes. However, it has to be appreciated that if you did an inspection of a care home and you had concerns, you might have to do several follow-up inspections. So these were very much predicated on this was the maximum interval we would anticipate undertaking inspections, but there was always an element of, for some care homes, bearing in mind that our legislation is strengths-based, so we would always be trying to work with providers to improve a service. It might have needed more than one inspection, and that could distort the programme.
In their supplementary statement to the inquiry, the CQC set out that CQC recognises that on-site inspections are an integral part of regulation. Do you agree with that? And if so, why?
I think inspections are a very powerful tool in a regulatory framework. However, good regulation starts before the inspection process, which is why we have such a robust registration process. The aim of registering services is that only people who are fit and proper to do so run services, and that we're confident that they're able to deliver the quality and safety of services that people deserve. And so inspection is a powerful tool, but it is not the only way that assurance is provided.
Perhaps, if we may, we'll take a look at some of the actions now which took place in the pandemic, and we can explore the various tools which were used. If I may have up on the screen INQ 497197. And this is correspondence from yourself, which is dated the 10th of March 2020. And these 3 bullet points in the middle of the page are outlining, in effect, what are going to be the guiding principles going forward. We'll be focusing our activity where it's needed most. We will support local authorities and providers, and we will honour our duty of care to our colleagues. The sentence immediately below that then states, we will still be carrying out inspections, but we will be reviewing inspection plans on an ongoing basis. So on the 10th of March was the plan to continue with inspections as they had been going on. And was there any discussion at that stage about a suspension or withdrawal of inspection activity?
As I say in my letter, we were keeping all the notifications and concerns we were receiving under review, but as of the 10th of March, the position was exactly as I wrote in that letter, that our intention at that stage was to continue carrying out inspections, but that we would keep the matter under it was actually under a daily review at that stage.
We then come to the 16th of March, which I think is actually, if this letter is the Monday, the 16th is the Friday. And you made the decision to pause routine inspections. We can see from the data in the witness statement that for the financial year 2020-2021, only 308 inspections took place, as opposed to over 10,000 the year before.
Not 10,000.
10,502, perhaps? Or maybe forgive me. But on what factors, so on the 16th of March, whenever you're making that decision, on what factors were you considering to reach that decision?
So there were a couple of key factors, one of which was on the 12th of February. We'd had a staff member return from being in one of the affected countries abroad, and they had developed COVID symptoms and had taken a test. While we were waiting for those test results was probably one of the most nail-biting periods, because 2 days before we'd had that announcement, she'd been at all staff training, and then all the inspectors from that event had gone back to offices across Wales and out to services across Wales. And that brought home very powerfully the potential impact that we could have on services. And then on the 12th of March, we received our first notification of suspected COVID in a care home. On the 13th of March, we received our first notification of confirmed COVID. By the 16th of March, we'd had 11 other notifications of COVID in care homes and domiciliary support services. And then on the 16th of March, we had our first notification of a death from suspected or confirmed COVID. And at that time, it seemed prudent to reflect and consider what we did going forward. We knew very little about the virus at that stage, how it was spread, and so the pause seemed sensible and prudent in response to the facts that we had as of the 16th of March.
I appreciate, as you've just outlined, that things were changing on an almost daily basis. You set out at paragraph 86 of your statement that the Care Inspector Wales did not consult with stakeholders about this decision. Was that because of the rapid nature with which things were changing?
Yes.
And would it have been preferable to have had the opportunity to consult?
I didn't consider there was the time to do it. At that stage, it was a pause so that we could regroup, we could consider how many notifications we were getting through. And I felt it was more sensible for the sector that we paused. And that was that was for several reasons.
In terms of this pause then,
Yes.
what, if any, consideration was given in that decision-making process to inspections continuing but with IPC and testing and masks? Was that option, or testing and PPE, was that an option available to you?
So there were two main factors that caused me to make that decision. The first of which was the thought of our inspectors taking COVID into a care home, of which we were the regulators, and we know how vulnerable many of the people who live in our care homes are. That just seemed unacceptable. The other main reason was it was an incredibly fast-moving situation with very little knowledge of what was happening. And so it seemed appropriate to enable local authorities and to providers to give them the space and the opportunity to concentrate on looking after people in their care rather than worrying about a potential inspection.
So if I'm understanding you correctly then, the availability or otherwise of testing and PPE wasn't a primary factor in that decision, it was more trying to control the spread, which could potentially be coming from inspectors.
And at that stage, I think we were at a different phase in the coronavirus. But of course, we didn't have testing and we didn't have PPE in March, the inspectorate.
You set out then in correspondence that a key priority is to continue to provide assurance to the public and the Minister regarding the safety of services. I would just like to explore some of the means by which you sought to do that while this pause was in place.
Yes.
You set out in paragraphs 88 to 89 of your statement that you wrote to local authorities asking them to share information with us in a timely way on any service you have concerns about to enable us to assist with contingency planning. Why was that correspondence necessary? Is it not self-evident that all these bodies in Wales should be communicating, in particular communicating with the independent regulator if there is concerns?
But it's also about providing reassurance that people understand the framework within which we're operating. Sharing of concerns is nothing new, but during a time of extreme pressure in the social care sector, when providers were concerned, the public was concerned, it felt really important that we were very clear what we would be doing to provide assurance.
And you then go on at paragraph 90, and I wonder if we could perhaps get this on the screen, please. It's at INQ 569773. During the latter part of March 2020, although no physical inspections were undertaken, inspectors continue to monitor and follow up on notifications, concerns or safeguarding instances, and services already on the enforcement pathway. Was this Care Inspectorate Wales already doing these things prior to the pandemic?
Yes, every notification that comes into the inspectorate and every concern that comes into the inspectorate is looked at by an inspector and reviewed and decisions made as to whether and what action we would take.
So what, if any, enhanced oversight measures were introduced that once inspections had been paused, that the Care Inspectorate Wales was undertaking in order to ensure that there was oversight of the sector? So
although inspections were paused, we intensified our scrutiny and monitoring of services, initially with a series of checking calls, and we did approximately 11,000 of those from the end of March into August. And they were done for several reasons. One of the first reasons was to provide support to providers. It enabled us to provide a live voice as to what it was actually like in the services we regulate and inspect. There were occasions when we could provide guidance to help, or we could ask others to provide guidance to help. But we could also raise issues, both within government and with others, of specific issues that we felt care home providers and domiciliary support providers needed reassurance and support with. Those later moved on to monitoring calls, I'm sorry.
No, please forgive me, I spoke over you. I was just going to simply say that those calls were introduced on the 30th of March 2020. Yes. And you emphasised in your statement that the purpose of these calls was to check in with providers
Yes.
rather than check up on them.
Yes.
I just wonder, what's the significance of the distinction there, and could the calls not have done both?
If you think on the 23rd of March, we went into a lockdown, and a care home in particular is someone's home. Pre and post-pandemic, they were vibrant environments. People would be popping in and out, and chiropodists, there were various functions. And then on the 23rd of March, none of that could happen. And so providers went from operating in that field to a field where not only were they responsible for the daily physical care of an individual, but there was limited visiting, limited access, and so keeping the people who lived there engaged, stimulated, is an equally important part of looking after people who live in residential care. And so at that stage, it seemed more important that we should be checking in and providing support rather than our normal regulatory oversight. When providers are having to send staff to queue for bread, and the issues that were faced by the sector in those very early days, it seemed far more proportionate and flexible to be providing support rather than anything else. However, if things had come to light, we may have taken a different view. But at that stage, with the state of the environment in which they operated, that seemed prudent and sensible and supportive, because our focus is always on the people who receive and work in these services.
I hate to labour the point, and you've already said that these calls didn't necessarily correspond with your normal regulatory oversight. Did these calls perform any regulatory function, or did they perform a different, more supportive function?
I think at that stage they were very much a supportive function. This was the early days of the pandemic. There was little known, little treatment, and for some care homes it was incredibly stressful.
And in the absence of physical inspections, on-site inspections, were these calls in any way a substitute or an alternative for the assurance that those on-site inspections would provide?
They were different. And in a sense, the regulatory work we have always done is very much a partnership. Within social care, we have different roles and functions, but providers of social care are as committed as we are to ensuring that they provide the best possible care to their services. And the thought of we're not crossing a threshold means that wouldn't happen, I don't think is an accurate reading of how care providers operate.
The Care Inspectorate of Wales did produce a feedback report in September 2020
Yes.
of the nature of these calls and what was discovered. In that, you flagged that there were significant issues with PPE, for example, in the
Yes.
first number of months of the pandemic. What specific action did Care Inspectorate Wales, apart from dealing with the provider on the phone, on the call, was there a role for Care Inspectorate Wales here to raise these matters with the likes of the Welsh Government and Public Health Wales to ensure that any trends regarding PPE or other issues were appropriately flagged and could be addressed?
Yes, and we did that on a regular basis. We would message Welsh Government officials, we would message Public Health Wales, we would talk to local authorities. We saw that as part of the support that we could offer, is using the themes that emerged from these calls to try and ensure action took place. And you'll see from the September report that as May, June develop, the concerns around PPE are dramatically reduced as these issues were addressed.
Moving perhaps on to a different tool then, you talk in your statement about how a pre-existing internal RAG, red, amber, green
Yes.
system was repurposed in order to provide a rating for the pandemic preparedness or nature of each service. And you say, paragraph 100, based on this intelligence, inspectors made an assessment of the impact on COVID-19 at the service and the likelihood it would continue to impact on the service. You then go on to say, where this assessment indicated emerging or immediate risk to life or significant harm or neglect to people living at the service was subject to increased levels of monitoring. This included frequent calls, and then through that, ultimately, to the prospect of an inspection. The risk or immediate risk of life or significant harm, was that too high a threshold in a scenario where there's no eyes and ears on the ground in the form of inspectors to trigger some type of oversight process?
So these are services that we are familiar with. These are services that we have registered. These are services that we had a relationship with. These are services that we would know of any pre-existing situations that would give us cause for alarm. Have a highly experienced inspectorate team who would be familiar with assessing information as it came in and making decisions about action that needs to be taken. And so in all those circumstances, then I think that was appropriate.
Okay. Thank you for that. And if I may move on then to a change in approach which occurred the 31st of July.
Yes.
Whenever the Care Inspectorate Wales moved to a recovery approach. And you state with more inspections based on risk and supported by having PPE and testing. And just so we're abundantly clear, when did inspectors have available sufficient PPE and testing to enable more inspections?
In June 2020. But community transmission was still quite high at that stage. And we thought we were in recovery phase, which is why we made the decisions we did. And then, of course, as you'll be aware, we moved into a very different position as autumn emerged.
If we could just keep in this kind of late summer type period.
Yes.
Now then, you go on at paragraph 108 to state that in August 2020, Care Inspectorate Wales did not believe that it could return to full routine inspections. You justify this as saying that providers were under significant pressure and Care Inspectorate Wales did not wish to unnecessarily add to this with regulatory burden. Obviously, there's a public interest
Yes.
in regulation being performed. At
Yes.
that stage, where there appears to have been ample testing and PPE and also an impact on visiting and external oversight for a number of months, would that not have been an appropriate time to return to more routine inspections?
At that stage, we were still very focused on services that we had the most concerns about. And I think there's a huge public interest in making sure that providers are able to concentrate on looking after people in their care. That March to July period in care homes and domiciliary support was an incredibly difficult period. And so our view was, knowing our providers as we do and working with them, that to have returned to a routine inspection programme at that stage wasn't appropriate. But we did start to do inspections, but very much based on risk at that stage.
I do wish to reassure you at this juncture the inquiry is well aware of the pressures on the sector during that period of time, and I hope my questions aren't interpreted as anything other than that. Also then in August 2020, the Care Inspectorate Wales replaced check-in calls with monitoring calls. Could you just then explain the distinction between check-in
Yes.
and monitoring, and is this a shift more then to a regulatory aspect to these calls?
Yes, at this stage, the first wave of COVID was over. We hoped we were moving into a slightly different time. And so monitoring calls were much more an exercise, more of our regulatory functions again. We still talked about PPE and issues of concern, but we would also ask questions about the quality of care reviews, what training was going on, how families were being supported to contact their, how residents were being supported to contact their families. And so it was much more, we had a checklist of questions that our inspectors would go through, which were more akin to normal regulatory activity. And we did about 2,500 of those. Those calls were done on a monthly basis,
And just
as opposed to the weekly, fortnightly of the check-in calls.
thank you very much. And if I could just perhaps pause at this moment to reflect on the check-in and monitoring calls, okay? I'd like to give you a chance to comment on the witness statement from a former care home manager from Wales who's given evidence to the inquiry, and it appears at INQ 587639, and specifically at paragraph 62. It says, Care Inspector at Wales sent a letter on the 16th of March 2020 saying they would not do any inspections because of COVID, but had weekly calls with them. They wanted to see how we were coping and asking if we were giving people activities. They did little to assist. I would just like to give you the opportunity to comment on that. You've indicated these calls are designed to offer support and be supportive. It would appear to be this individual's experience anyway that wasn't the case. Is that a general reflection or reflective of a wider opinion?
I was very, very sorry when we heard in May of 2020 of the death of Mr. Huff. Mr. and Mrs. Huff were very passionate about their service, and they were especially passionate about protecting their residents from COVID. I'm sorry that she didn't find our support of help, but many providers told us that they did find how we approached our check-in calls to be very helpful.
I think, and I accept that I've taken you to this statement, it was perhaps we're making the more general point of, was this feedback which the Care Inspectorate was receiving that ultimately these calls did little to assist?
No. On our National Advisory Board, which is made up of Older People's Commissioner, various others, it's also, we have providers of service and service users on that. And the feedback that we were getting from the calls in particular was that many people found our check-in calls to be of benefit. And I'm just very sorry in this instance that it didn't secure that for Mrs. Huff, and I'm very sorry for that.
And in the event of a future pandemic, would the Care Inspector at Wales adopt a similar approach, i.e. starting with these check-in calls and then moving to perhaps a more regulatory-focused monitoring call?
I think it would depend on the nature of the pandemic and how much we knew. In the circumstances of what we were faced with and our providers were faced with in this March, the spring and summer of 2020, I think this provided scrutiny and clarity. In a future pandemic, it would depend what was known about transmission as to whether we would repeat this or do something different.
Right. Forgive me perhaps for jumping on, but there is we don't have a huge amount of time allowed. In November 2020, the Care Inspectorate Wales indicated that inspections would continue, and then ultimately on the 4th of August, it returned to a perhaps more structured routine approach. Is that correct?
Yes.
And perhaps if we could have up on screen INQ 56977341, which is table 5 from your witness statement. And while that's loading, earlier on I indicated there'd been some 10,000 inspections. Of course, it's 1,052, so please forgive me, that was my error, and I wish to correct the inquiry record on that. If we look at the bottom line then, 1,052 inspections in by March 2020, dropping to 308. But then by the end of 2023, we're back to pre-pandemic, if not slightly higher than pre-pandemic levels.
Yes.
That perhaps differs from approaches taken by other regulators, such as the CQC and RQIA, where they never perhaps have returned to pre-pandemic levels of inspection. Why was that approach taken in Wales?
I can't comment on why other inspectors made the decisions that they did. Are you asking why we increased the number of inspections?
Why, you've returned to what appear to be routine inspections at a similar level as pre-pandemic.
Yes.
I'm not asking you to explain RQIA or CQC's position, but why was it important to Care Inspector at Wales that there was a return to what appear to be routine inspections?
We made the decision as soon as the position was clear with COVID and the pandemic that we would return to our routine inspection programme. And what these figures show is that we did return to our routine inspection programme. And in 23, we were preparing for changes to our framework as well. And so this is what we said we would do, and we did it.
Just before perhaps we move off the topic of inspections,
Yes.
I'd like to give you the opportunity to reflect. In terms of the risk posed by a solitary inspector attending a care home in March 2020, would it not have been reasonable, in light of everything else that's going on, for a single inspector to attend at a home to carry out an inspection to ensure that oversight was in place?
A single inspector could have taken COVID into a care home. And for us in Care Inspectorate Wales, the risk of that, as the regulator, was unacceptable at that stage. We put in place robust monitoring, regular contact with providers, so we could continue to assure the public and ministers that their services and the people they loved were safe and being well looked after.
If I could just invite you then to comment on the CQC's addendum statement. They state, in the event of a future pandemic, strenuous efforts should be made to protect the ability to carry out on-site inspections as much as practically possible. On-site inspections, together with other forms of regulator activity, play a vital role in assuring the safety and quality of services for the adult social care sector, but should be recognised that on-site inspections cannot safely take place in a pandemic if they increase risk to those in care. Do you agree that in the event of a future pandemic that strenuous efforts should be made to ensure that on-site inspections continue?
I think it would depend very much on what the nature of the future pandemic was and what the risk to people living in those care homes were. If you're asking me whether I thought I made the right decision in March about pausing inspections, I would do the same again, because at the forefront of my thinking was how can we best protect people with very complex care needs at a time when there was little treatment and very little known. And it would depend what the nature of another pandemic was.
I appreciate it's very difficult to speculate on what any future pandemic would look like, but is there anything practically which could be done in order to ensure that on-site inspections can be protected going forward in the event of a health crisis?
I think, as I've said previously, inspections are an incredibly valuable tool, but they are not the only means of providing assurance. And I think the interface we had with commissioners of services, the notifications we received, and concerns notifications increased by 24% in 2021. I was concerned that without the regular input of families and relatives visiting, that we might see a drop-off in that. But we messaged the staff of providers across and said, it's your duty to speak up. And so the intelligence we were getting during the pandemic was such that we had a line of sight into how care homes were operating through that period and domiciliary support services.
Before we leave the topic of inspections, I'm going to ask you about the Care Inspectorate Wales' ability to carry out virtual inspections.
Yes.
You do indicate in your pandemic that in practice, virtual inspection visits only accounted for 8%,
Yes.
or 66. So there was, the Care Inspectorate Wales did have the ability to carry
Yes.
out virtual inspections. And just to be clear, we're talking about virtual inspections of residential
Yes.
nursing homes. Why did it only account for 8%? What, if any, difficulties or issues prevented that being rolled out further?
So during the period of the pause, we did 808 inspections, and 786 of those were physical and 8% were virtual. virtual inspections were actually very successful in our inspections of children's care homes because they love taking the iPad around the home, treating it almost as a TikTok video, and they were a very rich source of information. It is very different in the adult care home sector, where although equipment was provided by Welsh Government, by local authorities, there's not the familiarity with the technology and the kit as existed for the children who loved it. And so the view we took was, we tried it for children's care homes, brilliant, not necessarily as successful in adult care homes.
And again, forgive me, I'm going to ask you to speculate perhaps, but in the event of a future pandemic, would there be greater scope for the use of virtual inspection technology? Could it play a greater role?
For children's care homes, absolutely. I'm not convinced for adult care homes and domiciliary support services, no.
Do you consider that there's a need for that it would be of assistance to have clear, adaptable protocols for remote, hybrid, virtual and in-person inspections, which could be reviewed regularly in order to make sure they're still valid and in line with data requirements, etc.? Would a clear process like that have assisted in any way whenever it came to March 2020?
I think the situation in March 20 was so unprecedented that the plans that there were in place, I don't think took account of a virus of which so little was known, and which, until we got the vaccines in December of 2020, there was no really effective treatment, certainly with the first two phases of the virus. So we have our own frameworks, which are regularly adapted and regularly looked at. I'm not sure how some of those would be produced in a way that's meaningful.
Thank you. If we could move on to briefly cover the issue of the discharge policy and perhaps some of the issues which Care Inspectorate Wales were raising with that in April 2020. You were asked, or the Care Inspectorate Wales was asked to comment on a draft of the admission and care of residents during COVID-19 incident in a residential care setting. And if I could please have up on the screen INQ 396527. This is a Miss Rooney, who's Deputy Chief Inspector, responding. And perhaps if we look at the second paragraph in the final sentence, the thing that's likely to jump out for them, I think that's providers you're referring to, is the message around accepting patients from hospitals, including those that may have COVID. And then the final paragraph talks about it being tricky to align two messages, one about the need for residents to shield, and one where care home providers are being encouraged to accept patients with COVID-19 into a home where many other high-risk people live and there may be no existing COVID. To the extent that it's not obvious, what exactly was the Care Inspectorate Wales's concern at that time?
We were pleased to have the opportunity to comment on guidance that government was thinking to issue. Our concern was, in the general population, we were saying to people with vulnerable health issues, you need to shield. Our other concern is that at that stage, very few care homes in Wales had notified us of a COVID outbreak. And therefore, we're not medics, but it didn't seem prudent or sensible to discharge people into a care home, either who were untested or who had been or were known to have COVID-19.
If I may take you to a further email then, which appears at INQ 198569, please. Page 2 of that chain. And the very bottom email is again from Miss Rooney.
Yes.
Hi all, this is an email to Public Health Wales and the Welsh Government. I am sorry, we would not be happy to brand this as Care Inspectorate Wales as it currently stands. You state the majority of the content of the guidance is exceptionally useful. However, we are concerned about the section on discharge. First of all, would it normally be the case that Care Inspectorate Wales's branding would appear on guidance produced primarily by the Welsh Government and Public Health Wales.
Only if we were asked to.
And having been asked in this instance,
Yes.
you go back and say, or Miss Rooney goes back and says, we're not happy to brand this as
Yes.
Care Inspector Wales. What in effect was Miss Rooney saying? On one view, branding could seem like a relatively trivial issue, but is she saying we can't stand over this?
Well, it may sound a trivial issue, but not to the sector, because what it meant is it gave us freedom to remind providers of Regulation 14, which could have been suspended by Welsh Government, which wasn't. And Regulation 14 says that when a provider agrees to look after someone, they have to be satisfied they can not just meet the needs of that person, but they have to take account of the impact of that person on the rest of the residents in their home. And so frequently asked questions guidance, which we first published on the 1st of April, was very clear that providers should only accept people into their care homes where they could have account of whether it was possible to safely look after them without an adverse impact on others. Because our view was you could safely look after an individual, but the nature of care homes, and particularly people with dementia who will often wander around a care home, how you could keep people safe in those circumstances was very difficult.
In later correspondence, Miss Rooney almost proposes that the solution to this problem as a whole might be for further testing. She makes a suggestion on the 8th of April. I also think if people being discharged from hospital care homes were tested, this would substantially increase the number of providers willing to accept.
Yes.
And she says, I understand testing capacity is a challenge. So was testing the answer to Care Inspectorate Wales's concerns?
As I said, we weren't medics and we didn't have to make some of those impossible balancing judgments. We were aware that there was a significant concern as to the functioning of the NHS and the prospect that it would be overrun and therefore the population across Wales would be in difficulty. But we didn't have to make those balancing judgments. As the social care regulator, what we were concerned about was social care services and people who used them. And so for us, with the information we were getting from providers and what they were telling us about what was happening, it seemed sensible that before anyone went into a care home, and particularly was discharged from a hospital, they should be tested. Now, at that stage, I know there weren't that many tests available, and the average local authority had 15 tests a day to use. But that seemed a sensible position for the Care Inspectorate to take. It was.
Are you aware if the issues being raised by the Care Inspectorate Wales were addressed in the final version of the guidance, which I understood issued on the 9th of April? Were those issues?
Do you mean the final guidance on the 7th of May, or the first guidance on the 9th of April?
The first guidance, forgive me.
They weren't addressed.
And how long did it take for those issues to be addressed ultimately?
The guidance, a letter was sent out to all providers on the 22nd of April and local authorities saying the position on testing had changed and that people would be tested. That guidance wasn't actually disseminated until the 7th of May, but the letter on the 22nd of April was very clear that the Welsh position had changed.
The letter then is roughly some 2 weeks after Care Inspectorate started raising concerns, and the final version of the guidance then would be over a month later. What do you consider the impact of that delay to have been on the adult social care sector?
I don't know how many people were discharged from hospitals into care homes at that time. And it's difficult now without that information to tell. I mean, clearly from a reassurance point of view for providers, they were very keen for people to be tested before they went into care homes. And many were very robust about saying we will not accept people without test, and we supported them in those decisions.
Your statement very helpfully includes a list of proposed recommendations or issues you'd like the inquiry to consider, and one of which is that the importance of coordinated communication for successful hospital discharge, recognising family members and providers are partners in care for many people.
Yes.
I just would like to ask you, how would that recommendation help resolve the type of issues that we've encountered here in these emails?
The coordinated dissemination of information. Providers and others were telling us that one of the issues they faced with is the amount of guidance that was coming through. Very fast change, and if you think with our visiting guidance, we issued 14 iterations of that, reflecting the state of COVID across Wales. And it was very hard to assimilate some of that guidance. And it seemed in future one version of the truth, one way of disseminating, so that people get the right guidance at the right time, I think would be a tremendous reduction in duplication and an opportunity for people to say, well, guidance 32, that's what we're following now.
If I just may briefly touch on the issue of visiting.
Yes.
And the Care Inspectorate Wales's role with regards to that. And paragraph 253 of your statement, you outlined that Care Inspectorate Wales facilitated a stakeholder group to inform the development of non-statutory guidance.
Yes.
And the group first met on the 1st of June.
Yes.
That stakeholder group, who was included in that stakeholder group?
So the Older People's Commissioner, Children's Commissioner, Welsh Local Government Association, the Association of Directors of Social Services Wales, the Voluntary Council for Wales, Care Forum Wales, Housing Department, and facilitated by us and Welsh Government. It was, I'm sure many people have said this, one of the most emotive decisions of the pandemic were issues around visiting and the impact not just on residents but on family and friends who couldn't see their loved ones. Was really difficult. And so it seemed helpful to bring everyone involved to discuss how we could safely facilitate visiting. And so our view was that what happened in care homes should exactly mirror what happened for the public. So if the public couldn't meet inside, we understood that would be the same in care homes. If public could meet outside, that should be the same for care homes. And so the work of this group was to, through a very difficult period, that because the second winter was particularly difficult, and we helped facilitate the development of the pods and access for providers to get those, to make sure that people could see people as safely as possible.
If I may just reverse ever so slightly, just to paragraph 256 of your statement, you said, Care Inspectorate Wales ensured stakeholders of the group included representatives of people with a learning disability, so their specific needs were recognised in the guidance. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in what way were their specific needs recognised in the guidance?
Because their voices would be part of that stakeholder group. It was so emotive that to have people there representing all the people impacted, because there were instances of people with learning difficulties who weren't able to access some of their work functions, and it just seemed, here's a forum where we can get together and see if, by working across groups, we could come up with a solution that enabled visiting to take place as safely as possible.
You state then that the key objective of the guidance was to ensure the balancing of the rights and responsibilities in relation to people, visitors and staff. On reflection, do you think the guidance, which I understand was published on the 23rd of June, achieved that?
That was the first version, and then there were 13 other versions that came after that. And so I think he did. Part of what we did as well is we ran seminars on the risk assessment and also seminars to make sure people understood what the guidance was saying, because this was one of the issues that was constantly raised. A lot of the concerns that came to us towards the end of 2021 were understandably about family members, that there were instances, even when visiting was permitted, some areas would not be following the Welsh Government and the Public Health Wales guidance. And so we were able to intervene both by flagging those issues to Government and Public Health Wales, but also directly dealing with the providers to remind them of their regulatory responsibilities in connection with visiting.
Before turning to a slightly further discussion about what recommendations you think might be useful, I just want to talk to you very briefly about two discrete issues you raise about data and about the sharing of information. So if I may please have INQ 569773 and page 58, which should be paragraph 175 of your statement. And a paragraph D therein, talk about the sharing of information and engagement with Public Health Wales and ONS. You say, however, it was clear that there were different definitions of what constitutes a care home. What impact did that have on the ability to validate data? And has that been resolved? Is everyone now using the same definition of what is or is not a care home?
So we worked very closely with Welsh Government's Knowledge and Analytical Support Services and the Chief Statistician to make sure that our data lined up. We used the legal definition, as in the Social Services Wellbeing Wales Act, of a care home, which is, as stated there. Public Health Wales and ONS categorised other care settings, so supported living accommodation. So it might have distorted the figures because there were many more supported living facilities in Wales. The reason we worked with them is so that the differences could be understood and explained. And in the briefings that were being produced by the group, it was made very clear what the data was and what the data was saying.
And then if I may move down to paragraph E, you say that Care Inspector at Wales is unable to provide data on the number of staff working in social care services. And
yes.
The inquiry has heard some evidence in this in recent days. I'm just wondering if I could take your view on it. Is there a need for a register of social care workers to be maintained?
So we're the regulator of services. Our colleagues in Social Care Wales are the regulators of the workforce, and there is a registration process, but that isn't ours, and so we don't collect that data at the moment.
And was the issue here then that the Care Inspector at Wales wasn't the appropriate person to ask for that information? It would have been somebody else?
It wasn't us.
Thank you. And then just coming on and returning back to a section of your witness statement which I referred to earlier, which entitled Key Lessons Learned and Reflections. And in paragraph G, you state that the interdependence, this is your recommendations, the interdependence of the health and social care sector, recognising providers of social care services should be treated as equal partners in care, and people working in social care sector should have parity of esteem in terms and conditions. I suppose my first question is, what impact did this have on the management the pandemic in the adult social care sector during the pandemic?
I think it's a few things. So health and social care services have got to be seen as interdependent and not senior service and junior service. And at times in the pandemic, there was a much wider public recognition of the value and importance of social care. But going forward, that needs to be addressed. And part of the problem is that everyone appreciates how terrific our health services are and what a privilege it is to have them, because we've all used them. But until it's your dad or your gran or your child that needs support, social care operates very much under the radar. And social care workers the workforce demonstrated during the pandemic the extraordinary support that they provide, and giving them parity of esteem, giving them parity of terms and conditions would help with recruitment and retention, and it would help with that phrase that you use is, I'm only a social care worker, or this is unskilled work, whereas it clearly isn't. And if we want to attract people to see social care work for the rewarding career opportunity it is, parity of esteem, terms and conditions, would help enormously with that.
And then I suppose just finally then, with regard to returning to Care Inspectorate Wales's regulatory role, what could be done in the event of a future pandemic to ensure that the Care Inspectorate Wales continues to provide the necessary insurance, both to the Welsh Government and, of course, to the public?
So our framework has changed, as you can imagine, since these days. In 2023, April, we began a programme of silent rate-ins, which we did for 2 years, working with the sector to co-produce the descriptors. And I think what was particularly encouraging is in 23-24, 74% of the rate-ins awarded for the sector was good and excellent. So having gone through all of this to come out at the other end, and so the frameworks we have now, I think, enable us to provide assurance in a very clear way to the public and our Welsh Government ministers about how good care is.
Thank you, Ms Bransky. I have no further questions, my lady. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beach. Mr. Stanton is next, and he's over there.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Ms Bransky. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. I have a question for you in relation to routine testing. At paragraph 178 of your statement, there is reference to an email of your deputy, Margaret Rooney, of whom we've heard already. Ms Rooney sent an email dated the 24th of April 2020 to the Welsh Government. The reference for that email is INQ 000396515, but we don't need to go to it. Within the email, Ms Rooney makes a recommendation to the Welsh Government that all staff and residents in care homes should be regularly tested, whether symptomatic or not. It then took some considerable time before the Welsh Government moved to this position, and it wasn't until the 15th of June, as I think you probably know, that regular testing of staff was introduced on a weekly basis. Can I ask what action, in addition to Ms Rooney's email calling for testing, did you take to press the Welsh Government to introduce earlier routine testing?
As I've said earlier, we were very conscious of the availability of tests in Wales at that time. But our view was that testing should be facilitated. So as from the 16th of May, testing was extended to include all symptomatic and asymptomatic care home residents and staff. It's the weekly testing that didn't come in until the 15th of June, but the testing began from the 16th of May, and we had regular conversations with the Chief Medical Officer's Office, the Chief Nursing Officer's Office, and as I understand it, Welsh Government was working towards it during that time. They were very aware of what our position was on testing in care homes.
You've indicated they were very aware of your position. Were you making more regular submissions and representations beyond that referred to of Ms Rooney?
We were in constant discussion with Welsh Government policy officials and the Office of the Chief Nursing Officer and the Chief Medical Officer during that period.
Is it fair to say you think the Welsh Government should have moved sooner on this issue?
As I said earlier, we were in the unenviable position that we could focus simply on social care. we're not medics, and therefore, as I'm aware, Welsh Government was following the advice of medical officials, of which we were not one of them. So it's hard to say at what stage they could have moved faster. Those would be questions for Welsh Government and not Care Inspectorate Wales.
Yes. Was that the response provided to you by the Welsh Government, that they were following scientific and medical advice?
The responses that we had formally are in my exhibits through the system, but it was clear from everything we were told is that they were receiving advice and they were following that advice. These issues were being taken very seriously. The meetings I would have regularly, which were daily at one point, was with the Deputy Minister for Health and Social Care. And she was very concerned about testing, about the outbreaks of COVID, about the number of deaths in care homes. And so she was regularly advised of those things.
Thank you. Can I very briefly take you to one more topic? That is notification of deaths made to you by care homes
Yes.
during the pandemic. If I could have up on screen, please, INQ 000 198 645. Ms. Baranski, this is a section of a spreadsheet containing notifications of deaths in care homes. You'll see within the spreadsheet at rows 7 to 8, the peak of the pandemic is captured.
Yes.
And in column F, you can see there the total number in April of 1,231. Just in passing, alongside that figure is the suspected or confirmed case COVID-19 related deaths, just around 350. Is it fair to say that's a significant underestimate?
I mean, all I can say is that from our notifications, which came from providers in the period we're talking about, from the 1st of March to the 29th of June, we had 2,205 notifications of deaths of care home residents. That was 14% or 13.9% of all reported deaths. And 1,668 of those were confirmed COVID and 537 were suspected. But of course, in the early stages, there wasn't the amount of testing that there was, for example, in January 21, when we had another peak.
Yes. And can I ask you about the second wave or the second peak? You'll see at rows 13 to 16, the numbers start to increase through October, November, December. Can I ask, having gone through the awful experience of the first wave, once you started to see the numbers rising in this way, what specific actions did you take to seek to avoid a repeat?
All we could do as the regulator of social care is share the information, and we were privileged to be part of lots of working groups, and our role on those working groups was very much to say, this is our data, this is what we're seeing, and to provide a deep understanding of what was happening in social care at that stage. The levers to address some of this were not within the gift of Care Inspectorate Wales. And what happened with us in December 20, because other things were different, we continued inspecting, we continued providing information, and we continued the oversight. But it was very difficult to watch the January 21 wave. And what became clear is until we had the vaccines, and the first person was vaccinated in Wales on the 8th of December 2020, and until lateral flow tests were regularly available, it seemed, and sometimes that the epidemic was almost unstoppable.
Thank you, Ms. Bransky. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Ms. Beattie. Ms. Beattie's over there.
Thank you, Mel.
Good afternoon. I ask questions on behalf of disabled people's organisations. On the 6th of April, in an email, for the reference, it's INQ 000 500 163, you highlighted in an email to senior Welsh Government officials, including the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Nursing Officer and Chief Executive of NHS Wales, that DNA CPR was an issue needing urgent consideration. And you asked, how confident are we that residents and their families understand the implications of a DNA CPR? And then moving forward to your annual report of 2020-21, in that report, the Chief Inspectorate said, we saw examples of blanket decisions being made in relation to DNA CPR. So going back to that email of the 6th of April 2020, what steps did the Inspectorate take to ensure from then onwards that residents and their families did understand the implications of a DNA CPR?
So, Care Inspectorate Wales is not the regulator of healthcare in Wales. We're not like CQC, we're the regulator of social care. But from our checking calls, there were references by providers to concerns around DNA CPR. And this email was prompted by a very sad email that came to us from someone who, a resident in their home, had died in the most distressing of circumstances. And so I wrote to the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Exec of the NHS, Chief Nursing Officer, and the Chief Social Care Officer for Wales to talk about the need for there to be assurance that end-of-life medication and care and palliative care could be dealt with as effectively as possible. 790 of our care homes didn't have nursing, and therefore they didn't have access to end-of-life medication and to oxygen. And we contacted Healthcare Inspectorate Wales, we discussed the issue, and so on the 21st of April we issued the joint statement. Advanced care planning is a part of managing end-of-life care for individuals, and there is very good guidance available which needed to be followed. And therefore, we reminded those concerned of the guidance that existed and the need to ensure that no blanket decisions were made. These are individual discussions that needed to take place with the individual, their family, their carers, and their advocates. And then, as the calls showed, most providers felt that this was an issue that in care homes wasn't a continuing issue. The Older People's Commissioner raised this with me on several occasions. We followed up every notification that we got that this was a concern. And I think the issue about one of our lessons learned is to make sure that providers of care and families are to be seen as partners in care, and therefore a clear understanding of how DNA CPR should be used. There was also a letter that you'll be familiar with that had been written by one GP practice, and I think that caused a wider perception of this was an issue. But for us, this was an issue that lasted for the early days, and then it seemed that this was a problem that was resolved because there was a very clear pushback from Welsh Government, from ourselves, from Public Health Wales, that you cannot make blanket decisions about DNA CPR.
So that's a message being sent to the sector. What about actual investigation of whether those DNA CPR notices were put in place and then relied on in the way, for example, in that distressing case, with a very real consequence for the individuals involved?
I mean, all we could do in that instance is deal with the issue as it pertained to a care home. The issue of whether GPs were using it was an issue for our colleagues in Healthcare Inspectorate Wales. If ever it came to our attention, we would share it with them, but we wouldn't have had the power to take that forward. What we did do is whenever we were aware of it, we would follow it up and notify the appropriate people.
well, whether together with the Health Inspectorate Wales or unilaterally, I mean, do you accept that an investigation into the issue of inappropriate DNA CPRs would have helped reassure care recipients and their relatives that there was regulatory authority knowledge and oversight of these matters?
I'm not sure, apart from the instances we were aware of how widespread it was, and it wouldn't be for us to direct another organisation to tell them how they exercise their oversight. Though having said that, every issue we drew to the attention of Healthcare Inspectorate Wales, they took forward. And I know there was action over the specific instance on the 5th of April example that came to our attention.
But would your organisation have been well placed to do that work in the care sector, leaving aside the health sector?
If it had become an issue in the care sector, we would have taken action with our colleagues. But at one stage in May, 89% of providers were telling us they were confident to provide good quality end-of-life care, and 95.5% of providers were telling us they had access to end-of-life medication. So it was raised, but in a very small number of cases with us. But I couldn't answer how frequently it was raised. I'm sorry, with Healthcare Inspectorate Wales.
And one further topic, which is taking you back to the check-in calls, which you've been asked
Yes.
some questions about. Between the 30th of March and the 26th of June 2020, the Care Inspectorate produced 10 qualitative analysis reports of those, the information that came from those
Yes.
calls as part of the check-in calls, and put forward findings about that. What qualitative analysis did the Care Inspectorate do of information received not from the providers but from people using the services and their relatives, friends and
Yes.
advocates, as distinct from what you were being told from the providers and managers of those providers themselves?
So because the voice of people receiving, using services is usually a fundamental part of how we work, in July we contacted about 213 residents of our homes to talk to them about their experience of living in care homes during the pandemic. There were some wonderful responses, very mixed responses, but the overall feel from that is they felt that people had done everything they could to keep them safe.
And as I understand it, sorry to interrupt you, that was an initiative taken in July to make specific contact, is that correct? My question really concerns the earlier crucial period from March to June 2020, when, as we've heard, there were reduced or no routine inspections, very limited external contact with those services. So were there any qualitative analysis or contact of what you were being told by people in that time, before this initiative in July?
We were still receiving concerns, and concerns from relatives are often about things that they're told by their relatives. But I can't recall any of them specifically that were about what it was like in a care home. And I appreciate the July call was in July, but the discussion with individuals concerned was very much about their experience during that whole period of what it was like to live in a care home. And most of the responses were very positive about the support they'd received. They clearly missed their families. One person said, "I just wish I was 20 years younger and living at home." But they were generally very positive, and it may have been done in July, but the questions were about the whole experience of living in a care home during that really difficult period.
Okay, but you can't assist us with anything specific done before that July time?
Only the normal conversations that we'd be having.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. That completes all the questions we have for you, Ms Bransky. Thank you very much indeed for all your help. Did you have the help of colleagues in preparing your statement? I suppose you possibly did, I don't know. But if you did, thank you to them as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for what you've contributed, and safe journey back to Wales.
Thank you.
10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All rise.